Hello, I'm Alma Angeles. We're moving to the next stage of the pandemic, and as the world resets to the new normal, we find ourselves seeking the right balance between health and livelihood, constantly adjusting the boundaries between liberty and responsibility. And now to the news. First, staff at the U.S. consulate in the Chinese city of Chengdu were busy packing belongings and removing the American insignia from the building on Saturday, a day after Beijing ordered its closure in a tit-for-tat diplomatic battle with Washington. Take a look. Now, U.S. China relations spiraled this week when the Chengdu mission was told to shut in retaliation for the forced closure of Beijing's consulate in Houston, Texas, with both sides alleging the other had endangered national security. The deadline for the Americans to exit Chengdu remains unclear, but AFP reporters saw cleaners carting big black bags of rubbish from the consulate on Saturday, one of which had split and appeared to contain shredded paper. Now, at least 10 sacks were removed from the building in the early hours of the morning. A worker on a small crane removed a circular U.S. insignia from the front of the consulate, as you can see here, leaving just an American flag flying. Earlier in the week, the Trump administration ordered China to close its consulate in Houston. An official said the decision to shut down the Chinese consulate was made to secure U.S. intellectual property and curb Chinese espionage. Now, Beijing said closing the Chengdu consulate was a legitimate and necessary response to the unreasonable measures by the United States, and has alleged that staff at the diplomatic mission endangered China's security and interests. Take a look.
On July the 24th, today, the MFA informed the U.S. Embassy in China of its decision to withdraw its consent for the establishment and operation of the U.S. Consulate General in Chengdu, and also made specific requirements on the ceasing of operations and events by the Consulate General. On July the 21st, the U.S. launched a unilateral provocation by abruptly demanding that China close its Consulate General in Houston. The U.S. move seriously breached international law, basic norms of international relations, and terms of China-U.S. Consular Convention. It gravely harmed China-U.S. relations. China's measure is a legitimate and necessary response to the unjustified act of the U.S. It conforms with international law, basic norms of international relations, and customary diplomatic practices. The current situation in bilateral relations is not what China desires to see, and the U.S. is responsible for all this. Once again, we urge the U.S. to immediately retract its wrong decision and create necessary conditions for bringing bilateral relations back on track. Some of the personnel in the U.S. Consulate General in Chengdu engaged in activities inconsistent with their capacity. They interfered in China's internal affairs and harmed China's national security interests. We lodged multiple representations. The U.S. knows this crystal clear.
Tensions have soared between the two powers on a range of fronts, including trade, China's handling of the coronavirus, and a new security law for Hong Kong, with the U.S. this week warning of a new tyranny from China. Washington officials, meanwhile, said there had been unacceptable efforts by the Chinese consulate in Houston to steal U.S. corporate secrets and proprietary medical and scientific research. The last Chinese diplomats left the Houston consulate on Friday as a 72-hour deadline to close the mission passed. Officials there were seen loading large sacks of documents and other items onto trucks and throwing some in bins. Take a look. Meanwhile, the United States said Washington's order to China to close its consulate in Houston was to protect U.S. intellectual property and private information. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said that the Chinese consulate in Houston, which Washington has ordered shut, was a center for espionage and operations to illegally obtain U.S. companies' trade secrets. Again, let's listen in.
Yes, our action to direct the closure of the PRC Consulate General in Houston was taken to protect American intellectual property and Americans' private information. For years, the CCP has undertaken a whole-of-society effort to steal American technology and intellectual property for commercial gain, and many of those activities are directed from PRC diplomatic facilities, and we urge the CCP to cease these malign actions rather than engage in tit-for-tat retaliation. So that's where we stand on that.
Just this week, we announced the closure of the Chinese consulate in Houston because it was a hub of spying and intellectual property theft.
Before the news emerged, firefighters and police were called on Tuesday evening to the consulate building in Texas on reports that documents were being burned in trash cans. The courtyard, according to local media, the Twitter feed of the Houston Police Force said smoke was observed, but officers were not granted access to enter the building. Now, underscoring the point, on Friday, the Justice Department announced that a Singaporean political consultant based in Washington had pleaded guilty to recruiting American targets for Chinese intelligence. Take a look. It also said that a science researcher at a California university who hid her ties to China's People's Liberation Army and then fled to the Chinese consulate in San Francisco had been arrested and would face visa fraud charges. Junwei Yeo, also known as Dixon Yeo, entered his plea in federal court in Washington to one charge of operating illegally as a foreign agent. And in the plea, Yeo admitted to working between 2015 and 2019 for Chinese intelligence to spot and assess Americans with access to valuable non-public information, including U.S. military and government employees with high-level security clearances. It said Yeo paid some of those individuals to write reports that were ostensibly for his clients in Asia, but sent instead to the Chinese government. Yeo was recruited by Chinese intelligence while working as an academic at the National University of Singapore. He had researched and wrote about China's Belt and Road Initiative to expand its global commercial networks. And according to his LinkedIn page, he worked as a political risk analyst focused on China and ASEAN countries, saying he was bridging North America with Beijing, Tokyo, and Southeast Asia. The World Health Organization has recorded the highest rise in global cases in a single day. The pandemic shows no signs of slowing. Take a look. The total rising now by 284,196 in 24 hours. The biggest increases were from the U.S., Brazil, India, and South Africa, according to a daily report. Fatalities rose by 9,753, the biggest single-day increase since a record high of 9,797 deaths on April 30. And deaths have been averaging 5,000 a day in July, up from an average of 4,600 a day in June. The top U.S. health body has issued new guidelines on the reopening of schools in the U.S., clearly weighing its recommendations in favor of having students return to their classrooms in the fall. Now, White House Press Secretary Kayleigh McEnany has said children still should go back to school. Let's listen in.
Still an open question how rapidly children under 10 can actually spread COVID-19. But the other day, the president said they don't bring it home very easily and they don't transmit very easily. So shouldn't we figure out which one of those it is before kids go back to school?
So let me give you two answers to this. First, I would point you to CDC guidelines that said based on current data, the rate of infection among younger school children and from students to teachers has been low, especially if proper precautions are followed. There have also been few reports of children being the primary source of COVID-19 transmission among family members. That's where the data currently stands. But that being said, even if there is transmission transmission and later studies come out, let's say, we believe that students should be going back to school because the effect on a child, we know scientifically, they are not affected in the same way as an adult. Again, I'd point you to CDC guidelines on this that says the best available evidence indicates if children become infected, they are far less likely to suffer severe symptoms. Death rates among school-age children are much lower than among adults and far lower than during the H1N1 pandemic, for instance, when schools remained open.
But the issue isn't just about whether children can get seriously ill. It's whether they can become disease vectors themselves for their families and wider communities. According to the CDC's latest advice, just posted on its website, the best available evidence that has emerged so far suggests that children are unlikely to be major drivers of the spread of the virus. However, this does not correspond with the latest notable study on the matter, which was published last week in the CDC's own Journal of Emerging Infectious Diseases. The study conducted in South Korea showed children younger than 10 transmit to others much less often than adults do. But those between the age 10 and 19 can spread the virus just as well as adults. Meanwhile, Florida's main teachers union sued Governor Ron DeSantis and other authorities to stop schools from reopening in August as the state has become a U.S. epicenter of the pandemic. The Florida Education Association, which represents 140,000 teachers, says the state constitution asserts that schools must provide a safe and secure environment, but that the COVID-19 resurgence is remarkable and out of control. Let's listen in.
Here in Florida, we have an increasing number of cases, an increasing number of test positive rates in our state. And so a lot of parents, myself included as a parent, and a lot of our people who work in our schools are very concerned about whether or not it's safe to go back. In Florida, we've had well over 23,000 cases of COVID among kids under the age of 18. Over 20,000 of those cases have happened in the last month or so. So we've seen that the spreading is going much faster among our students, our children under the age of 18. We know we've had increased hospitalizations among kids under the age of 18. The Commissioner of Education under the governor's watch came out and said, we're going to reopen all brick and mortar schools, the actual buildings. We're going to have kids go back to their school buildings, and we're going to do that regardless of what's happening with COVID. And so we do not believe that is responsible. The Florida Constitution here in our state says that the government has the responsibility, the state government has the responsibility to have, among other things, safe schools.
President Trump is pushing to reopen U.S. schools that abruptly shut this spring when the coronavirus first began spreading across the country, despite teachers and families' concerns that children could contract or transmit the disease should they return to the classroom. Meanwhile, Dr. Anthony Fauci gave some guidance for teachers and children if they should go back to school. Let's listen in.
Level of infection. But what the officials need to do is to look at the level of activity of virus in the community. Because what we get confused at is we make the United States a unidimensional phenomenon. It's not. It's very much different, geographically, demographically, and the level of infection. So there will be some states, cities, districts, counties, where the level of infection is so low that you don't have to worry about anything regarding bringing your children back to school. Just bring them back to school, no problem. But there are some in which you have a level of activity where you got to balance if you are going to bring the children back. You know, you talk about the elderly, there aren't a lot, I think, at least the elderly people that I know, there aren't a lot of elderly people that don't have at least one underlying condition besides old age. When you talk about forcing teachers to come back to school, you better be careful about that and make sure you pay attention to keeping them safe and keeping them healthy.
Meanwhile, the World Health Organization Friday expressed concern over a coronavirus resurgence in Europe as Britain and Austria tightened restrictions and China stepped up testing. Europe accounts for a fifth of the world's more than 15 million cases and remains the hardest hit in terms of deaths, with 207,118 out of 633,711 worldwide, according to an AFP tally at 1100 GMT on Friday. The WHO's European chapter pointed to rising cases on the continent over the past 2 weeks, stressing the need for tighter measures if required. Like other regions, Europe is struggling to balance restrictions with the need to breathe life back into economies that were devastated by the virus and subsequent lockdown. The continued danger was highlighted on Friday by the death of a 3-year-old in Belgium, the country's youngest coronavirus fatality. Bahamian Prime Minister announced that the country will enter a weekend lockdown at 10 p.m. until Monday, July 27 at 5 a.m. Let's listen in.
Starting tonight at 10 p.m., a weekend lockdown will be implemented for all islands of the Bahamas, excluding Grand Bahama, who is currently under a national lockdown. Grocery stores, pharmacies, gas stations will be allowed to operate for the public during this weekend lockdown from 7 a.m. to 6 p.m. During a lockdown, unless you are an identified essential worker, you may not leave your place of residence for any purpose other than to seek urgent medical care or to purchase food or medicine. You may exercise within your immediate property only. Essential workers will be permitted to provide critical services, including the National Food Distribution Task Force and other NGOs for food distribution purposes. We anticipate more weekend lockdowns going forward until the health indicators suggest that it is safe to do otherwise. Effective Monday, the 27th of July 2020, commercial activity will continue as normal, except as follows. A new curfew from 7 p.m. to 5 a.m. will be implemented. Accordingly, all business activity must be completed by 6 p.m.
As of yesterday, there were 274 confirmed cases of coronavirus, 119 in New Providence, 120 in Grand Bahama, 21 in Bimini, 4 in the Berry Islands, 4 in Cat Cay, 2 in Cat Island, 3 in Morris Island, and 1 in Great Guana Cay. South Korea reported a surge in new coronavirus infections on Saturday, recording its highest figure in nearly 4 months with dozens of imported cases. The country added 130 new cases, including 86 among people who arrived from overseas, bringing the total to 14,092, according to the Korea Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. It was the second highest figure since March 31, when the country reported 125 new cases. It was also the first time it has seen more than 100 cases since April 1. All overseas arrivals are required to undergo a 2-week quarantine. South Korea endured one of the worst early outbreaks outside China, but brought it broadly under control with an extensive trace, test, and treat program, while never imposing a compulsory lockdown that was put in place in much of Europe and around the world. The country has been seen as a model on how to combat the pandemic, with the public largely following safety health measures such as wearing face masks. And anyone venturing out in Australia's second biggest city was ordered to wear a mask as authorities struggle to contain multiple coronavirus clusters in the country's southeast. Most people seen by correspondents on the quiet streets of Melbourne city centre wore masks in the second week of a 6-week local lockdown. Victoria State, of which Melbourne is the capital, recorded 357 new cases, 5 deaths. The mandatory mask order allows police to issue fines of 200 Australian dollars to anyone who refuses to cover their face in public, although previous lockdown rules have generally been enforced with warnings. Victoria has effectively been sealed off from the rest of the country in an effort to contain the virus, but new cases have been detected in neighboring New South Wales or South Wales state, sparking tighter restrictions in its capital, Sydney. In Vietnam, the country has detected its first locally transmitted case of coronavirus in nearly 100 days, according to authorities on Saturday, in a country whose swift and full lockdown won praise for controlling the spread of the disease. Patient 416 is a 57-year-old retired Vietnamese man in the southern city of Da Nang and the first community transmission since April 16. Local health officials have tested 105 people who had been in close contact with him, according to the Ministry of Health. The man had taken his mother to a hospital in the days before after showing symptoms of the sickness, according to authorities, but gave no confirmation of how he was infected in a country where the virus appeared to have been stubbed out for several months. The patient is currently on ventilator support due to respiratory failure, it said, adding his family believe his contacts with others were limited. Da Nang has been packed with local tourists returning to its beaches and restaurants since Vietnam lifted its lockdown. Now, despite sharing a long ungovernable border with China, Vietnam has recorded just 416 virus cases, including the latest from Da Nang with no deaths. Communist authorities were quick to lock down the country after the virus emerged in neighboring China, with a rigorous state quarantine and contact tracing system put in place. International flights remain strictly limited with a 2-week mandatory quarantine laid out for visitors. And some analysts say the tough response to the virus will help the economy as foreign investment and local consumer confidence bounces back. Eagle News will be right back. Portland, the biggest city in the U.S. state of Oregon, has seen nightly demonstrations against racism and police brutality for nearly 2 months, initially sparked by the death in Minneapolis of unarmed African-American George Floyd. It is also now the scene of a controversial crackdown by federal agents ordered by U.S. President Trump, one that is not supported by local officials. Thursday's mainly peaceful demonstrations ended like many before it, in a showdown between protesters and police, which escalated in a haze of tear gas and flashbangs. Clashes erupted by around midnight, though the two sides were separated by a protective fence reinforced by a barricade. Protesters targeted the federal courthouse, a flashpoint in the demonstrations, hurling trash and launching fireworks over the fence. Blazes then sprang up. Federal agents wearing fatigues lobbed tear gas canisters back at demonstrators, used flashbangs and fired pepper balls after declaring the gathering unlawful. At about 1:30 a.m., law enforcement moved from behind the fence into the streets, advancing on protesters. Meanwhile, White House Press Secretary Kayleigh McEnany slams rioters in Portland and shows reporters video footage she says is from overnight unrest in the city this week. Take a look.
Rioters, a federal agent's hand was impaled by planted nails. Another federal agent was shot with a pellet gun, leaving a wound deep to the bone. And tragically, 3 federal officers were likely left permanently blinded by the rioters using lasers pointed directly at their eyes. These are not the actions of so-called peaceful protesters, and the Trump administration will not stand by and allow anarchy in our streets. Law and order will prevail, and I have a short video for you.
Protests in Portland directly linked to George Floyd's death started to lose steam in early July, but then reports emerged of federal officers taking demonstrators away in unmarked vehicles. The city's Democratic mayor, Ted Wheeler, has accused federal officers of triggering a dangerous escalation of the situation with abusive and unconstitutional tactics. And as he met with protesters on Wednesday, Wheeler himself was hit by tear gas, an incident he described as flat-out urban warfare. Meanwhile, huge anti-government demonstrations erupted in Russia's Far East on Saturday over the arrest of a popular governor who was replaced this week by a Kremlin appointee who never lived in the fraught region. Residents of Khabarovsk, near the border with China, took to the streets en masse for the third Saturday in a row after Governor Sergei Frygal was arrested by federal law enforcement and flown to Moscow on murder charges this month. The running demonstrations have been some of the largest anti-government protests in years, which the Kremlin said this week were being fueled by opposition activists outside Khabarovsk. Tens of thousands of residents marched through Khabarovsk, waving the region's flag, carrying also banners and chanting slogans against President Putin. On Monday, President Putin officially fired Sergei Frygal, 50 years old, and appointed a lawmaker from the same nationalist LDPR party, Mikhail Decherev, as his acting replacement. The move was met with anger from Khabarovsk residents who said that the 39-year-old outsider lacked experience and had no connection to the region. And Hurricane Douglas weakens to a Category 2, plus Honolulu allows 50 or more in shelters despite a COVID case increase. Alfred Asenas brings us the details. Alfred.
3, 2, 1. 1, 2, 3. Aloha, Alma. This is the latest on Hurricane Douglas that's still working its way westward towards the Hawaiian Islands in the Central Pacific. As of Saturday, July 25, 5 p.m. Philippine time, Hurricane Douglas has since weakened from a Category 3 to a Category 2 storm system with maximum sustained winds of 110 miles per hour, or roughly 177 kilometers per hour. Still moving west-northwest at a slightly increased velocity of 20 miles per hour, or 32 kilometers per hour. Hurricane strength winds can be expected in some parts of the state between late Saturday and Monday, July 27 local time. Large swells from the shore will start impacting parts of the state on Saturday, while flooding rains, heavy rains, could begin late Saturday and continue through Monday in certain areas, especially the low-lying areas like Honolulu and Waikiki, like I mentioned last night. In addition to the latest development, Honolulu Mayor Kirk Caldwell signed an emergency proclamation authorizing expenditures of funds for a quick and more efficient relief effort ahead of the storm. An example of this is that indoor gatherings of 50 individuals or more will be allowed, as residents may need to seek shelter in a hurricane designated emergency shelter. Also, he has partially activated the Emergency Operations Center of the City and County of Honolulu in order to manage the citywide response and coordinate the efforts with their counterparts in the state government. The EOC, as it's called, will switch to a 24-hour schedule as the storm approaches Honolulu, and the officials there gain more details on what they can expect to happen with the storm. Depending on the forecast, the City and County of Honolulu will be opening up to 25 shelters at various locations around Oahu in coordination with the Red Cross. Now, I mentioned some of the shelters that can allow up to 50 individuals. This does raise concern by some, especially those who are continuing to prevent the spread of COVID-19 here in around Honolulu. Speaking of COVID-19, remember last night I said we reported there was, last night was the highest, or yesterday was the highest single day count. Strike that. Today was the highest single day case count of COVID-19 with 60 confirmed cases today. So that's the new record, unfortunately, for the state of Hawaii. Let's take a look at what we have here. So this is the latest outlook according to the National Weather Service, with the storm expected to make landfall again late Saturday, early Sunday morning. With this shape of the cone of uncertainty, there's what is not portrayed here is the size of the storm. So the leading edge could touch the Big Island, which is normally the first to get hit around Saturday. So that's the current estimates. Now, if we're going to ask, what about my location here on Oahu? Right now, estimates are suggesting probably early or noontime on Sunday, July 26th. That's when Oahu, this island, can start feeling the effects of whatever is left of tropical Hurricane Douglas. I almost forgot to mention that earlier today, now the island of Oahu is now under hurricane watch. Meanwhile, Big Island and Maui are placed under tropical storm warning. Now, instead of a hurricane warning, that's because they're, right now current forecast suggests that it'll more than likely be downgraded to a tropical storm. Still deadly with these lots of rain, lots of winds, and lots of surf, dangerous surf hitting the islands. So that's the latest we have here for you, Alma, and we anticipate the storm to get weaker, but of course the effects will be the next big issue. For now, reporting from Honolulu, Hawaii, I'm Alfred Asenas, Eagle News. We live in interesting times. Back to you.
Thank you, Alfred. Stay safe, stay healthy. Our ABC Hawaii Bureau. A top United Nations official said the climate emergency is a danger to peace as climate change exacerbates existing risks of conflict and creates new ones. Let's listen in.
The climate emergency is a danger to peace. There is no automatic link between climate change and conflicts. But climate change does exacerbate existing risks and creates new ones. Around the world, fragile or conflict-affected situations are more exposed and less able to cope with the effects of climate change. It is no coincidence that 7 of the 10 countries most vulnerable and least prepared to deal with climate change host the peacekeeping operation or special political mission. We must remain vigilant and summon the courage to adapt our established approaches to ensure they are fit for a climate change world. And above all, we must translate words into action.
It is not surprising that in Niger, most of conflicts between rural people occurred between farmers and herders. Farmer and herders competition is worsening in central Mali and northern Nigeria with a growing death toll.
The fight against climate change should not divide us. We fight it to save ourselves. And we fight it for the people around the world who are already facing violence and displacement as a result of climate change. They cannot afford to wait. And therefore, ladies and gentlemen, the time for diplomatic patience is over. This Council cannot negotiate with the realities of nature. Action is all that counts.
Speaking at a virtual meeting convened by Germany, which holds the presidency of the Security Council for the month of July. Exceptional and prolonged temperatures in Siberia have left parts of the Arctic warmer than Florida and fueled devastating wildfires for a second consecutive year, according to the World Meteorological Organization, while warning also of rapidly decreasing sea ice along the Russian polar coast. Let's listen in.
Parts of Siberia this week have again topped 30 degrees Celsius, so it's been warmer in Siberia than, many parts of Florida. We've had exceptional and prolonged heat for months now, and this has fueled devastating Arctic fires. And at the same time, we're seeing, rapidly decreasing sea coverage along the Russian Arctic coast. We're seeing, dramatic satellite images which show the extent of the burn surface. The fire front of the northernmost currently active Arctic wildfire is less than 8 kilometers from the Arctic Ocean. This should not be happening. There was a study published earlier this week in Nature Climate Change. It's not a WMO study, but it is indicative of the wider picture. It says that polar bears, which, as we all know, is a symbol of climate change, may be nearly extinct by the end of the century because of shrinking sea ice. In general, the Arctic is heating more than twice the global average. It's having a big impact on local populations and ecosystems, but we always say what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic. It does affect our weather in different parts of the world where hundreds of millions of people live.
Changes to weather at the poles will likely affect other more distant and populated places too, according to Ms. Nulles, thanks to a phenomenon known as teleconnections. Now, these are observed in weather events including El Nino, where cold and dry air reaches places that are more used to seeing warmer or wetter conditions. Now, a new study published in the journal Nature Climate Change warned that the iconic polar bear, also is a symbol of climate change, may be nearly extinct by the end of the century because of shrinking sea ice. The article suggested that high greenhouse gas emissions also will likely cause a steep decline in the reproduction of other Arctic subpopulations by 2100. Eagle News will be right back. The United Nations warned that the world's poorest also need help. Funding of $199 billion per month would provide 2.7 billion people with a temporary basic income and the means to buy food and pay for health and education expenses. Take a look.
So the notion of a temporary basic income emerged as a viable way forward to both address the containment of the pandemic, but also to address the extraordinary human suffering and the escalating situation for many of the world's poorest, those living below the poverty line and those just above the poverty line and very likely to fall below it in the coming weeks or months if nothing is done. It is for that reason that we consider the option of a temporary basic income as something that every country needs to examine in terms of its domestic response, national budget planning and measures that are being put in place. The harsh reality is that at this moment, the pandemic is reaching many countries that have a high number of vulnerable people, have limited social protection systems, and therefore we need to find ways in which we can address both the containment of the pandemic and the economic and social fallout. It is estimated that over $3 trillion would be paid by developing and emerging economies this year in debt repayments and interest payments. A debt standstill and a potential debt restructuring would be more than sufficient to cover both the financing of these temporary basic incomes and they would be not necessarily needed for every country, obviously. So in many respects, this is a potentially viable proposition to an otherwise unmanageable situation right now.
UN projections have warned that COVID-19 could kill 1.67 million people in 30 low-income countries. Now, the World Trade Organization's exiting chief acknowledged that the body was facing tremendous pressure, but insisted that a Big Bang reform was not the way ahead. In his last press conference as WTO Director General, before stepping down at the end of August, Roberto Azevedo insisted that he and his team had achieved everything he said we could have over the past 7 years. Take a look.
That I don't believe that a Big Bang reform is the way forward. We need to do things progressively, taking steps, sure steps and constant steps in the right direction. Instead of spending years deciding what the reform can be or what should reform encompass, I think we should move right ahead, which follows through on the previous answer. We need to be fast. We need to be quick. And as long as members decide these are things that we want to change, these are things that we want to do, the organization has to have the tools and the mechanisms to respond quickly. We did the very best we could do, and together with the Secretariat, and they know, we have worked way over, what would be reasonable to expect from human beings over this period. And we did our best.
But the Brazilian career diplomat, who made the surprise announcement in May that he would end his second term 12 months early, acknowledged that he was leaving the WTO in the midst of a range of dire crises. One of 8 candidates currently in the running to succeed Azevedo will be taking the reins in the midst of a devastating global economic downturn sparked by the COVID-19 pandemic, with trade negotiations appearing hopelessly stalled and trade tensions between the U.S. and China continuing to soar. At the same time, the appellate branch of the WTO's dispute settlement body, sometimes called the Supreme Court of World Trade, stopped functioning in December after years of relentless U.S. opposition. Washington accuses the court of major overreach and has blocked appointments of new judges, leaving it without the quorum needed to hear cases. Norway reimposed quarantine on arrivals from Spain over a spike in virus cases, but also said such restrictions would not apply to the team behind the latest Mission Impossible blockbuster. Star Tom Cruise and the rest of the crew will be allowed to enter the country in the autumn to film scenes for the 7th installment of the action franchise without facing any quarantine requirements, regardless of their previous destinations. The filming will take place under a strict health regime, and the members of the production will be kept apart from others during their stay in Norway, Agriculture Minister Olag Bollestad told a news conference. The filming, partly subsidized by the Norwegian Film Institute to the tune of nearly 5 million euros, is due to take place amid the majestic fjords of the Northwest. Mr. Bollestad said the film was important to show the world the nature, culture, and history of Norway, which also featured in the last installment, Mission Impossible Fallout. Now, by contrast, Norway has reimposed restrictions on travel to Spain after a rise in coronavirus cases. Travelers from Spain will have to quarantine themselves for 10 days when they arrive in Norway, adding to similar measures for those from Portugal, Luxembourg, Croatia, Romania, and Bulgaria. And finally, in our news, a visit to the world's oldest shopping mall during the pandemic. Jenny Santiago reports from Milan, Italy.
Buongiorno a tutti. Oggi unisciti con me per esplorare Milano nella nuova normalità, ma prima di uscire mettiamo la mascherina. Sì, arrivo. Siete pronti? Andiamo!
Per andare al centro dobbiamo prendere la metro. Sapete, l'Italia era uno dei paesi europei più colpiti dal virus Covid-19 e ora stiamo affrontando la fase 3, la cosiddetta nuova normalità. Le misure di sicurezza e di salute pubblica, come l'allontanamento sociale, l'uso di maschere e il numero limitato nelle riunioni pubbliche, sono ancora attuali. E seguire le misure di sicurezza è la nostra grande responsabilità per fermare la diffusione del virus.
Siamo arrivati al centro!
Al centro possiamo trovare la Galleria Vittorio Emanuele II. È uno dei centri commerciali più attivi e antichi del mondo e il principale punto di riferimento di Milano. L'Italia prende il nome da Vittorio Emanuele II, il primo re del Regno d'Italia. La galleria contiene rivenditori di lusso che vendono alta moda, gioielli, libri e dipinti, nonché ristoranti e caffetterie. Lo spazio ottagonale centrale è sormontato da una bellissima cupola di vetro. La galleria fu progettata nel 1861 e costruita da Giuseppe Mengoni tra il 1865 e il 1877.
Qualcosa di buono da mangiare? Ah, ecco! I panzerotti sono pacchi di pasta fritta e imbottiti ripieni di una varietà, come il pomodoro, la mozzarella originale, la classica ricotta, spinaci e il delizioso salame piccante. I panzerotti vengono cotti al forno, fritti e persino con ripieni dolci. A circa 2-3 euro puoi avere uno dei migliori snack economici della zona.
From EBC, Milan, Italy, I am Jenny Santiago and we live in interesting times. Alla prossima!
Thank you, Jenny. In time of physical and emotional distance, we give importance to the unsung service delivered by our frontliners. Our news correspondents positioned all over the world. Without them, we would not have the eagle-eye focus on the facts of this pandemic and its continuing repercussions on our lives. To our international correspondents, thank you for staying in touch with our viewers. Stay safe, protect yourselves and others. Good night. I'm Alma Angeles. We live in interesting times.